Let's begin with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father,
hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
well, we have come to the final segment of the Gospel of Mark. That final segment begins in chapter 11, and it starts with the portrayal of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. Now here in Mark's Gospel, that journey into Jerusalem will take one chapter. If you would happen to turn over to Luke's Gospel, you would notice that that journey takes 10 chapters. You can't have it both ways, so you have to wonder what's going on here. Well, Luke takes it and uses it for another purpose. He wants to teach us all about discipleship, and so he uses the journey to Jerusalem as a background for teaching about discipleship. And he has a lot to say, so the journey takes 10 chapters. Mark has already talked to us about discipleship. We heard him tell us some things yesterday in chapters 8, 9, and 10, where he had Jesus predict his passion. The disciples totally misunderstand what he's talking about. And then third, Jesus himself giving us a corrective teaching, telling us what discipleship is about. You could probably do the entry into Jerusalem several ways. If you wanted to just do it historically, it'd probably take about 3 lines. Not many people would have known about it. These are the high holy days in Jerusalem. That means that the population is going to be about 10 times what it ordinarily would be. Lots of people, lots of tension, lots of excitement, lots of everything. And so if you would say, well, what probably really happened? Well, what probably really happened was Jesus and his disciples walked into Jerusalem. Hardly anybody cared, hardly anybody knew. There's no references to it outside of the Bible here. And he went and ultimately went over to the temple. Now, when he got to the temple, he did some rather serious things, but by and large, historically, we wouldn't know much. Mark is not interested in telling the story like that. Mark wants to say, let's look at what happened through the eyes of faith, remembering that we've already factually understood Jesus has suffered, he already has died, he's been buried, and we believe he's been raised up, and that gives us a different perspective on everything. So Mark says, let's talk about the entry into Jerusalem from the perspective of our faith. We don't care historically what happened. We want to talk about what would it look like, what would it have seemed to be if we would have viewed it from our faith perspective. And that's what he does. This is all not so much historical, this is about faith. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, go into the village ahead of you immediately, and as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Matthew's version, it says a colt, the foal of an ass. Matthew thinks that means 2 animals. So when Jesus goes into Jerusalem from Matthew, he rides 2 animals. It's what he thought it said, but it really isn't what it said, just one animal talked about in 2 different ways. You'll find a colt tied there that's never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says, why are you doing this? Just say this, the Lord needs it, and will send it back here immediately. They went away and found the colt tied near a door outside in the street. And as they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, what are you doing untying that colt? They told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus, threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. This would be, if we were living at the time this was written, we would have understood this as the protocol for what happens when a king or a member of the royalty enters a city. You would never just sneak in if you were a royal person or some kind of an executive person. You would have been all lined up. You wouldn't walk in. Certainly you would come in on some kind of an animal. There would be people planted along the way to cheer you. Whether they liked you or not didn't matter. They'd be paid to do this, so they would do it. And you would walk in on the back of this animal. That would be understood. So Jesus is being portrayed here, the way Mark is telling it. This is our King. He is our Messiah. He is the Son of God. It's only fitting that he come in riding on a donkey, because that's exactly, he is that kind of royalty, the Messiah. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and were followed by shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven. And that will be the liturgy, actually, that you probably will experience this coming Sunday. They'll tell you to go outside or something, get in line, get in a procession, and then they'll sing this Hosanna, and the ministers and the priests will all process in, imitating this very liturgy here that maybe didn't happen historically, but certain in the eyes of faith, that's what really, really happened. Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. He hangs out at Bethany because there's no room probably in Jerusalem at all. Bethany's only a little ways away. He probably knows people there. Martha, Mary, they're from Bethany. Lazarus, he's from Bethany. So that's probably why he goes there. But he went in and noticed he looked at the temple. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but figs, for it was not the season for figs. He found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He sat on it and said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. A lot of people wonder about that. Why on earth would we have this little segment here about him going to a fig tree that ought not have any figs anyway? It wasn't the season, and so it doesn't, and so he gets angry and curses it. Well, keep that in the back of your mind. We'll come back to this fig tree. Then he came to Jerusalem. This is probably historical. What Mark describes here probably really happened pretty close to what Mark says. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling, those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers"? The officials from the Roman Empire and the officials from Judaism have some response to that. And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. For they were afraid of him because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. He doesn't seem to be too much concerned about what's going to happen to him. We might ask what really went on. Most of the commentators and devotional writers will tell you Jesus is angry because they have turned the temple into a commercial enterprise. It's sort of a first century Walmart, and he doesn't think that that's very suitable. Well, that probably could be true, but that's not what's going on here. This is what is called in the Bible a symbolic prophetic action. If you read the prophets very far, or very much of them, you'll notice that periodically, rather than speak their message, they act it out. Isaiah does this, Jeremiah does this, Ezekiel does a lot of it. Ezekiel sometimes looks like a crazy person when he does some of these symbolic gestures. And the purpose of this, of course, is to get your reaction, to get you to sit up and take notice that this is not just something he's speaking, but look what he's doing. And what he's doing is acting out the message. Now, if we would have listened to Jesus, watched Jesus, we would have known that he's really not trying to go after the commercialism. If you and I would have been asked, well, what do you think? Do you think that's a good thing, that you can buy animals here? And that you can get money and change money? Is that a good thing? Or is that something that you find insulting? Should that not go on here? All of us would say, no, that's perfectly fine. Here's our experience. We used to bring our own animal. We thought that would be the good thing. The law says to sacrifice an animal, the animal has to have no blemish. So we brought our animal down and we thought, this is really good. We gave it, showed it to the priest who looked at it, and he said, it's a fine animal, except. And then he would give us the exceptions, which were blemishes. And then he'd say, I'm sorry, but it's not suitable. But I have one I'll sell you. Well, we looked around. They're not ripping us off. So I tried this 2 or 3 times. Every time it was the same thing. My animal never passed, so I just bought one. I'm not going to do that. That's a waste of time. This is a great, they're doing us a service. You just go over there, buy your animal. It'll always pass because it's theirs. And sacrifice it. No muss, no fuss. Can't beat that. That's really a service. Not only that, but I got to come down here to pay my temple tax. But as you might guess, the money I have, the money they pay me with, is not temple money. It's secular money. It's got Caesar's head on there, and the people in the temple don't like that. So they won't take secular money. So what am I supposed to do? No problem. We've got these money changers here. You give them your secular money. They'll exchange it in kind for temple money. And then we got all these places around here where you can pay your temple tax. Couldn't be simpler. ATMs everywhere you need them. You just go pay. Nobody, none of us would have thought anything about that. None of us would say, that's commercialism, we don't like it. No, I didn't care at all. This was the outer courtyard. Anybody could come in the outer courtyard. This was not the Holy of Holies. So what's Jesus so upset about? Well, most people would say he's not really upset about the buying and the selling. He's doing all this as a symbolic action. Because what his message here is, and why he's doing it in such a violent way, he's saying this whole system is going down the tubes. Now, he's not the first to do something like this. If you would open up your book to the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 7, there's a very interesting scenario there. Jeremiah is standing on the steps of the temple, and he's preaching to his Jewish congregation. And what he's telling them is, this whole thing is going down the tubes. This whole thing is a system. It was meant to help us become holy. It has not helped us do anything except the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And the temple personnel have sold their souls to the Roman government. And so you might as well pack your bags and head into exile, because this is not going to last. It's going down. Well, you can imagine the response. That wasn't, well, thank you for that lovely message. You know, they wanted to kill him immediately because that was considered to be rank blasphemy. Talking about the temple. Now we know the temple was more than a building. The temple signified a whole system of thinking and living. The temple regulated most of your life, like it or not. Economic life, spiritual life, social life, all various forms of that. If you were rich and wealthy, you probably liked the temple. If you were a peasant, like most of the people Jesus hung out with and taught, you would have not much good to say about the temple. Every year they would tell you how much they're raising your temple tax, and every year it's going to be more and more. Your assessments are going to be higher and higher, and they don't care, because the rich are getting rich and the poor are getting poorer. And so you would have understood this. You would have understood what he's doing. Now, what he is doing when he talks like this is committing blasphemy. You don't talk against God's holy temple. And he just did. And you don't do anything else against God's holy temple, which he did. And so, and he knew this. This is not, well, if somebody would have told me, I would have done something else. No, it's not that at all. He knows exactly what he's doing. And so, you know, that kind of raises our question of why would he do that, knowing what's going to happen? In Mark's story, however, this event in the temple, the destruction of the temple, the so-called cleansing of the temple, is the direct motivation for why Jesus was killed, historically, not necessarily piously or theologically. Piously and devotionally and theologically, people say, Jesus was killed for our sins. Well, that's a theological statement. But if you would say, but factually, why did the Romans and the Jewish officials, why did they want him killed? Because, first of all, the Jews would say, he's a disgrace. He's blasphemed the whole temple. We can't have him out here preaching like that. The Romans are saying, he's a loose cannon. God only knows what he's going to do next. And if he starts doing these kinds of things, we're going to have riots on our hand. And if you have riots on your hand, you're in real bad, difficult trouble. So the solution would be not too difficult. We'd had it before. Kill the leader and the followers will scatter. And that's their theory. We will kill him, and then we'll watch the rest to follow him, and they will just scatter. So much for that. That sets the stage for everything that follows. We know for sure what's going to happen now, and it's just a matter of what happens. But you'll notice after he's done this, he doesn't run away. He goes back to Bethany, and then the next thing you know, he's going to be back in the temple the next minute and doing the same thing. You'd think, you know, you're in real serious trouble here. You might want to hang out somewhere else besides where these people can get you, because they're going to try to kill you. You know that now. He doesn't seem to have much to say. Chapter 14. Chapter 13 is a strange chapter. It's all apocalyptic, symbolic. Generally, it's a chapter that talks about being prepared for when the final event comes. The final event, the destruction of the temple. Question, had it already happened, or was it just about to happen? Scholars argue both ways. You can pick one or the other. Both of them make sense, but it's a wild chapter. It doesn't fit in much with the rest of Mark's style. Technically, and on Palm Sunday, where we will start reading in the church will be chapter 14. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. Those were two separate feasts that later on were combined into one. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth, secretly. They don't do anything above board. And to kill him, for they said, not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. Remember when Pilate was appointed the procurator general of this area, he had a terrible track record as a leader. This was basically going to be his last shot at it. The Roman people didn't really care for him very much. He just really wasn't very bright. And they gave him one dictate. Here's the one thing you have to do when you go there. No riots. Absolutely none, because when that happens, like during the High Holy Days, the bloodshed would just be astronomical. Keep a lid on everything. That's all you have to do. But when he first entered, his first act was to kind of desecrate the temple. And he almost caused a riot the first 5 minutes he got into Jerusalem. Finally, that kind of got settled down, but he's not the brightest person on the block. So they're not quite sure what he might or what he might not do. While Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, see, he's not supposed to be in the house of Simon. Nobody's supposed to be in Simon the leper's house. When you have leprosy, you're isolated. If anybody touches you, they become ritually impure. But of course, as we know, he doesn't really care much about that sort of stuff. So he's in there with Simon, and there's a bunch of other people too. He sat at the table. As he sat at the table, a woman came. Notice, no name. We don't know who this person is, but she's in there, the house with all those other people. A woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard. Nard can be found only in India. Today it's only found in India. Then it was very expensive. Today it's very expensive. So somebody had some money. Alabaster jars didn't go cheap either. So we're all sitting here and we're looking at this woman. She's got this jar. She broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. And we're looking at this, what in God's name? She gets up. First of all, we're shocked she broke this wonderful alabaster jar, for God's sake. And then the aroma from, she dumped it all over his head. But some were there who were saying to one another in anger, and we could understand why. Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, 300 days' wages. That's a lot of money to dump on somebody's head. And the money given to the poor. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. Question is, what is that service? that good service that she has performed for him. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish. But you'll not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Well, how did she know that? How did she know that he was about to be killed? Well, you could say maybe she guessed, or she heard what he had done in the temple and put two and two together. We don't know. Why doesn't anybody else seem to know? Especially, remember, those disciples who have been with him through thick and thin. Those guys, remember, they jumped out of the boat. Well, that was their finest hour because they've been going downhill ever since. Why wouldn't they know? They've heard threats from chapter 3 on. There's been threats about killing him. But it's only this anonymous woman with this alabaster jar full of nard who has the courage, because she probably knows nobody else is going to understand this. But she had the courage to do it. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand, before its burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. So what Jesus says here is every time we get together and proclaim the gospel, we should include this story. This story should be told all the time from now on. But if you look in, at least in the Roman Catholic lectionary, where we keep all of our liturgical readings, it ain't there. Not there anywhere. The only time it's even hinted at is when the Passion of Mark's Gospel is read in church on Palm Sunday. But that's not for that. I mean, it's read because it's the whole thing. Judas was in that room. And notice, then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray them. You wonder why we love to hate Judas. Judas is a type. He's bigger than life. Not to say he wasn't a real live figure, but he's bigger than life. You know, nobody names their dog Judas. Just would not seem to be right. Why is he so upset? Why do we consider him to be the preeminent betrayer? Remember, a few verses later on, we're going to watch Peter, and Peter really betrays Jesus. 3 times he denies Jesus when Jesus could use him the most. And yet Peter gets off almost pretty freed. Well, he's weak, he doesn't have much faith, but he's a good guy, he meant well. Well, no, he didn't. Look at Judas. Why are you so upset? He is the betrayer. Well, because probably Judas's problem was he was an ideologue. You get the impression that he was handpicked. Now, Jesus picked Judas. He wasn't a walk-on. So Judas perhaps thought, well, maybe this time it'll work. Maybe he's heard, because there were before him movements afoot to try to get the Romans out. Usually they were fanatical military people who got a bunch of people together and decided to go try to do something with the Roman army, and they'd last about 20 minutes and they'd all be killed. And basically the idea had gotten to, well, whoever wants to claim to be this person Let them go at it. If they are, well, then it'll work. If not, they'll be like all the rest, and they'll get killed. So let's not pay much attention. So they didn't. And maybe Judas was kind of like that, but maybe he said, well, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the guy. I liked his opening line, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. That had some hope. Maybe, who knows? I'll get in. I'll throw my hat in with these folks. Hoping that now, finally, we've got the guy we've been looking for. We've got the leader we need. And so he followed. And the longer he followed, the more discouraged he got, because nothing happened. The only thing this so-called Messiah did was he talked and walked and did a lot of healings. People like that. And Judas wasn't opposed to that, but this is not about just doing miracle healings. This is about starting a whole movement, about bringing in a whole new kingdom. And probably by this time, while they're in that house, Judas has almost come to the conclusion this has been a dead end. He's not going to do anything. I made a mistake. And so when that woman took that jar, broke it open and dumped it on Jesus, that was it for Judas. That was the last straw. He knew that that wasn't going to be a movement that he was interested in. Nothing was going to happen. Best thing to do, get him off the street. There's no indication Judas wants Jesus dead. But he certainly wants him off the street because they're going to go after us next. You know that. If they start going after him because of the stuff he's doing here, they'll be going after us. And so we better start protecting ourselves. So I'll turn him in and tell him where to find him and get him out. Problem with Judas was he didn't really understand what it meant to be the Messiah. He didn't know what a Messiah really was. He had an idea of a Messiah. His idea was that the Messiah was going to be a military leader. His idea was that this military leader would turn things around and finally give us what we want, our freedom from the Roman government. But that was only an idea. That wasn't Jesus' idea. The reason Peter isn't condemned so badly is because Peter doesn't have any ideas. He's not an ideologue at all. He is a person who has weak faith. And the gospel wants us to know even weak faith can be good. Ultimately, if you have weak faith, that's better than no faith at all. And poor Peter, he tries, but he's not an ideologue. He couldn't sit down with Judas and have a good discussion about the idea of a Messiah. Gives us a warning even today. Beware of ideologues. Beware of ideologues. They got a lot of ideas, but generally they don't pan out. The next thing Jesus does, of course, is right before his final moments, he shares a meal with his disciples. It's a Passover meal. And we know why he calls his disciples together. And in the course of that meal, he follows the ritual pretty well, but there's two places where he switches over a little bit. And one has to do with bread being blessed and broken. But then he adds some features to that bread being blessed and broken when he says, "For this is my body." He identifies this blessed and broken bread with his very body. And then he does the same thing, probably with the fourth cup of wine that was the part of the Passover ritual. Over that fourth cup of wine, he refers to that as his blood. And so we don't need his body and his blood right at this moment because we're all reclined around the table. But what he's telling us is when this whole event is over, you will still have access to my body and blood. You will still have access to me through your power as a group to make memory, to recall what I told you when I was here with you. to recall what it's like when I'm here right now in real presence with you, and in the hope we have for what's to come in the future, past, present, future. That's the same dynamic you get every time we celebrate the Mass. No matter what Eucharistic prayer we use, it all does the same thing. Starts with making memory of the past, focuses right here on this is my body, this is my blood in the present, and talks about the future where we hope God will come again and bring this all to a conclusion. That became for the Christian community the central sort of aspect and dynamic of faith, which we now know very well as the institution of the Eucharist, the most important aspect of our whole faith. So once that was over, once the meal is done, then they're going to capture him some way. They've got, Judas has this idea of how he's going to do it. Immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. And with him, therefore, there was a big crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests. Now, mind you, they're only after one guy, and it looks like they got an army. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." I always encourage people, go to your Google and type in the word kiss. And you'll be surprised how often that gesture is a gesture of betrayal, not of intimacy and love and all that other stuff. So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword, struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. St. Luke hates this. St. Luke has Jesus paste the ear back on. Mark, let it lay there. Who cares? Then Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." All of them deserted him and fled. Chapter 14, verse 50. That's the end of the disciples. They're gone. They'll never show up again. We'll see Peter as he's denying Jesus, but we won't see, they won't see anything that's going on after that. They're not going to see his death, nothing like that. So all of them deserted him and fled. This is the third major rejection by Jesus. Remember, his family thought he's crazy, chapter 3. Hometown, chapter 6, thought he was a fraud. Now his disciples, we don't know what they think, but they're gone, and they won't come back. There'll be one more after this. Here's an odd little vignette from Mark. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, and he left the linen cloth with them, and ran away naked. There's articles and books written about that. I don't recommend you read them. Trying to figure out, who is this guy? The Greek word is neonios, young man. What it basically says, there was laws about this also. If you captured somebody, throw somebody into jail at nighttime, you had to give them the linen undercloth for basically your underwear. It was against the law to steal a person's underwear and to keep it. At least the minimum kind of way of treating someone halfway decent was always give them back their inner covering. So what this means is it got so chaotic that people would just run away and leave that inner garment. That's how bad it got. And however, when reach the time of the resurrection and there's a young man in the tomb there, we'll notice that the same word is used, neonios. Some wonder, is there a connection between the neonios who ran away naked and the neonios who apparently got his clothes back over here? But most people say no, there isn't. This person in the tomb sitting on the stone waiting for the women to come is basically an angel. There are two trials are portrayed. These are the most difficult parts of the Passion narrative. Jesus appears before the Sanhedrin, and then he appears before Pilate. The Jews were not allowed to execute anybody. They could not employ capital punishment. So if you wanted to somebody in the Jewish community and you felt they had done something seriously enough that they needed to be executed, you had to get them to a secular court, because only the Roman court could declare somebody to be executed, a Jewish person to be executed. The Jewish Sanhedrin could not do that. So it's very important for them to move him very quickly from the Jewish Sanhedrin. And Mark says most of what the Sanhedrin had to say was fabricated anyway and was not really very accurate, because they're just wanting to get rid of him. When he gets over to Pilate, Pilate doesn't ever think Jesus is guilty of anything. But he doesn't have the stamina to say that. He hopes everything that he can try to bring to bear to get Jesus free will work, including releasing a prisoner at this time of year, which he say was a custom. And he thought, Pilate did, maybe he could build it up so when they got to the point of saying, now, do you want to go and continue releasing one of these prisoners because of the custom of, wouldn't you like to do Jesus? Wouldn't you like him to be? That's what he's hoping, to which they say no. So that's his last leg, and he just washes his hands of the whole thing. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. Pilate had Jesus flogged. A lot of times you died from flogging. It was really a big whip with metal arrows, like arrowheads at the end. And so when you got whipped with that, you ended up pretty bloody. A lot of people never got past that. And Jesus was flogged. And he was so weak that he couldn't carry his own crossbeam. Normally in crucifixion, remember, they crucified you in fields, not just one, 2 or 3. But you would, if you notice the crucifixion field, there'd be a pole vertically in the ground. Halfway down the pole would be a little peg, and close to the foot would be another peg. You were supposed to carry your cross. That was the cross beam. And then when they would get you there, they would just hoist you up, and it'd be a cross like that, not the kind that we see in the movies and so forth. So then they had to tie you to the cross, because the weight of a person would just couldn't do it. So they tied your arms and they tied your feet. But you'd notice that the way they tied you, you could never be straight. You were always bent. Your legs were bent a little bit, even though they fit on that peg at the bottom. And you could sit a little bit, but when you sat, your lungs or chest would sink a little bit. And this was all highly calculated, because after you were up there for a very short time, you'd notice that your lungs were starting to burn. The body automatically kicks into survival mode. The feet start pushing down on that peg to release the pressure from the chest. But the more you do that with the feet, all of a sudden you notice this terrific pain in the legs, cramps. So when you were on the cross, you were constantly in motion. You weren't comatose like the picture shows. No siree. You were trying to get air to breathe, and you're trying to get release for your leg. So you would be moving all the time. Well, they knew that, the Romans did, so they had a clever idea. Wouldn't it be neat if we could just nail some spikes in the wrist, and in the ankle. That way, as more you do like that, the more you're going to rip that skin. And that would certainly hurt a little bit more. So, archaeologists have found legs and arms with big spikes in them. So they compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. When they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, and they often offered him wine mixed with myrrh. That was a painkiller. He did not take it. And they crucified him, divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide which would get what. This is all from the prophet Isaiah, predicts all this. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." Ironic, that's exactly what he is. And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one at his right and one at his left. Remember James and John, places of honor? They might rethink that. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ah, you who would destroy the temple, build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross." The same way the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself." When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. Then 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani." That's Aramaic. It's a quote from Psalm number 2, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And this is the 4th and final rejection that Jesus feels. In his human mode, not his divine mode, in his human mode, he feels this has all been for nothing. Now, we know better. You and I know better. We've been told from the beginning of this story. So we know that that's not the case, but the people in the story don't know that. They don't know what we know. When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling to Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge, sour wine, put it on a stick and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come and take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. That's a symbolic gesture showing us that this was not in vain, that God has accepted the sacrifice of Jesus, and that the divisions between anyone inside and outside are no longer Jew, Greek, male, female. We are now all one because of what Jesus has done for us by his own sacrificial death on the cross. And so that rending of the temple is very important. And that shows us, whether anybody in the story can grasp it or not, that this was not a rejection, that God did, in fact, accept who Jesus was and what he had done. Now when the centurion, that'd be a paid Roman soldier, who stood facing Jesus, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's Son." The irony here is none of the disciples could get to this point. None of the disciples could say that. It takes an outside Gentile Roman soldier to say what we know is to be true, that Jesus is in fact the Son of God. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. Well, we know he's already been anointed. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun was risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth." Now mind you this, who was crucified. Here's the message. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there's the place where they laid him. So that's the good news. Only this angel and these women know this. And here's their mandate. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, and that he was going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. So that's what they're supposed to do. He's not dead. He's been raised up. He's headed off to Galilee. He'll meet you there. So hurry up and go after him. So, everything now depends on these women. So, verse 8. They went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The end of the story. To which most people, what do you mean end of the story? That ain't no ending. Well, it isn't my book, stops. If you look in your own Gospel of Mark, you got two more endings. People didn't like this ending. They thought something happened. Maybe the scroll got torn up and the last part wasn't there. But this is how Mark wanted it to end. And so now we're going to go back to something I've been warning you about for the whole week. How much you know. Mind you now, Jesus has been raised. He's headed off into Galilee. There he's going to be together once again. He supposedly meet the disciples. They're not going to find out any of this. So if this message of good news, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God has come near, repent and believe in the good news, if that message is going to get out, there's nobody in the story left to tell it. We hope these women would. That was our last hope. They're not going to do it. So who's left? Well, you. And you know everything. You know more than any of them anyway. Who is better prepared to go out and proclaim the good news than you folks? Now, you were set up and you weren't told exactly what was going to happen, but nevertheless, I kept warning you every day, you're going to know more than what anybody in this church. Pay attention, you're going to know more. There's going to be a reason for that. Well, now we have the reason. The ball has been knocked in your court. This is highly creative. The early people didn't understand that, so they got together and stuck some stuff from John and Luke together and made a couple other endings. But the Gospel of Mark ends in chapter 16, verse 8. And it ends with you now being summoned to go and tell the rest of the world what nobody in this story will tell them, because nobody in the story's left. And Mark has very carefully, from the opening line, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, he's very carefully taught you all the way through these 16 chapters. What you do with this, of course, that'll be up to you. But basically, you have been summoned to assume this position now because nobody else is left, and Mark has bent over backwards trying to adequately prepare you to continue to proclaim this gospel in two ways: by what you say, and most importantly, by how you live. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
My dear friends, as we come to the end of this week of Scripture talks, I want to say a few words of thanks. First of all, I want to say thanks to Father Hensell and the Sacred Heart Parish community who have given us the hospitality of such a pleasant space for these talks. Also, one of the amenities of the talks, of course, is the lunch that's packaged and distributed afterwards, and there's a group of people who do that. We want to express our gratitude to them as well. But of course, most of all, we want to say thanks to Father Eugene. Father Eugene has been giving these talks for at least 17 years. And the measure of his devotion and his commitment to this is gauged by the fact that not only has he been doing it all those years, but during the pandemic, he arranged with his special digital advisors to provide the transmission of the talks for us. So even during the pandemic when we had locked down, we still had the talks. So I want to ask you to join me in thanking Father Eugene very, very much. Father Eugene, I have a little something for you. Just an expression, a small token of appreciation for these fine talks, and also for the company you afforded me during your stay here. It's always a delight to have you. Father Eugene, is very, very learned, as you know, in the scriptures. He's probably the least high-maintenance person and guest I've ever had. So it's always a delight to have you, Father Eugene. Thank you very much. And this is a little something for you. With the end of these talks, we have concluded this stage in our Lenten journey. But now we come to really the most intense part, Holy Week, which begins this weekend. As we continue that journey, I pray that you all actually grow deeper and deeper in an understanding of who Jesus is and what our role is in proclaiming that good news by how we live and by what we say and how we live. So, blessed Holy Week to all of you, and thank you very much.